Hey everyone, Sleepy Reader here with another one of my slow countdown of vlogs. Just lately I've been reading lots of Adventures of Superman. This new series which does lots of short, standalone, non-continuity stories about Superman. And I've really been loving it. And it's made me wonder if I prefer really short stories, or if, the really good writers and artists we have these days can do even better work if they do short stories. Another thing that made me think of that was, this isn't the right issue of Thor. I can't find the issue before this, issue 11, was a standalone Thor story, almost a day in the life of Thor. And it was definitely one of my favorite stories of the month, if not my favorite story of the month. And so that just got me thinking about short versus long. And, many of these Superman ones are just 10 pages, and yet they're extremely satisfying. The Thor that I liked, that's not this actual issue of Thor, was 20 pages. Another really great recent, very one-shot story was in Astro City, and a lot of the Astro Cities are one-shot or a few issues. But this was not a blow-your-socks-off story, but it was a deeply satisfying story about one woman's life in the Astro City universe, a woman with powers but who did not choose to be a superhero or a supervillain. But, it was just a rich, full story told in, I believe, 22 pages. And the thing is, in comic books now, as a kid, I used to dream of kind of one long, endless story, and that seemed really cool. And now that's really what we get in a lot of comics. With the Jonathan Hickman kind of endless things, I think, to really appreciate his work, you have to read every issue of the Avengers, New Avengers, plus Infinity, and no doubt other stuff. What's happening in the X-Men since Marvel Now has just been all one long story, continuing on in lots and lots of issues. Of course, we all know about the style of events, which have a central, in this case, 12-issue story that also makes you spin out into all these other issues, so that the story might, to be fully contained in, just guessing, 50 different issues. It's just kind of mind-boggling. And of course, there are very good, lots of very good comics which are just one long story to be told in who knows how many issues, 70 issues in the case of Brian K. Vaughan's previous masterpiece. I think another comic that I really liked that was really all one story a while back was Lucifer, and I think that was 70 or 80 issues to tell one story. So that, in a way, this is kind of my comic book dream come true, these really long stories, but sometimes it's just too much. And, in the case of Thor, the story previous to this, by the same writer, in issue 12, in one 20-page issue, was kind of a rich, interesting view of the world, and then the next issue, 13, which is the beginning of the next sort of long arc, it claims to be one of 5, but in the last one, the last arc was really 2 5-issue arcs, so that calling them just 5 issues was more of a marketing for the trades thing, because they were really 10 or 11 issue arcs. Anyway, this first issue is quite good. It's a nice sort of opening setup to a fantasy novel kind of feel. But just one or two real story beats happens. Malekith, I'm a little bit of a spoiler, Malekith breaks out of prison, Thor drinks with his friends, Thor hears that something bad is happening, and he goes off to investigate and discovers Malekith is back. And that's it. And in some comics you could have done that in 3 pages. It's well done. I'm not dissing Thor, but it is kind of a disappointment after that really packed emotionally and plot and detailed of the previous issue. And it seemed like, comic books' roots are in short stories. One of the classics from the 50s, the EC comics, always had like 7-page stories, and that was it. The whole EC thing was built on maybe 6, 7, maybe some 8-page stories. I'm not sure. Never went longer than that. There's a whole art to the short story, and perhaps one would get also frustrated by these EC comics in that every story had to have a twist at the end. And writing for the twist then is what the writers were doing. But it's not a bad formula. Another seminal comic book, The Spirit, from the 40s, particularly the late 40s is when it was at its peak. Every single story was 7 pages. And every now and then there kind of was a continuing story thread for 2 or 3, but almost always it was a complete story in itself, and every story was in a different mode. There were crime stories, there were the twist stories, there were love stories, there were Christmas stories. So they just managed to pack, or they, mostly Will Eisner with his assistants, pack incredible amounts of stuff in 7-page stories. And I sort of continuing on the short story tradition was in the 70s and early 80s were the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, I should say, were the Creepy and Eerie magazine. And I suppose to a large extent, a lot of what was done in, this one's not going to fold open easily, a lot of what was done in the in heavy metal was short stories. So, now one thing that Eerie and Creepy did occasionally, especially as time went on, is have continuing recurring characters that would recur sometimes. But other than that, they were continuing the EC tradition of short, sharp, twist at the end kind of stories. I'm not giving you guys a very good view of this, pardon me. So, and of course, when I started reading comic books, Marvel Comics were the thing to me, and we're talking the mid-70s, mid and late 70s. Marvel, more the mid-70s, I guess. In the late 70s, I briefly gave up on comics because I was too old. You would have continuing stories in the Marvel comics to a degree, but nothing like what we have now. And the DC comics, when I first started reading, still would have one-and-done stories almost always, and often short stories, like a 15-page story and then a 5-page backup story. And that was not bad, but at the time I didn't I didn't go for it, and I think thinking about those things, when done in the wrong hands, the short story format can get very trite, I guess. But it seems like we've got a lot of good writers now, and just from reading some of these things, it feels like they almost do better when they're limited. So I think it would be nice if we had a return to a greater mix of the shorter stories in with the longer ones, and maybe an end to the really sprawling ones, or the really sprawling ones should be really rare. That's just my feeling at the moment. Because Daredevil's another one that, while there's a continuous thread, there's also a sense of every 1 or 2 or 3 issues at the most, kind of a closure of a story. It's a very easy comic book to jump on. There's a lot of individual issues you could read and just be very satisfied with those issues. And there's a real art there. It's not easy to do, but it is doable, and with, again, as I say, the really good writers, there's just a lot of competition to be a good writer and to produce good stories. You know, there are things like Wonder Woman that I love, but I can't recommend them to anybody unless they're able to go back to issue 1 and start from there. There's, you know, definitely one that just isn't going to make a whole lot of sense unless you've read all the issues. Anyway, and it kind of made me think, you know, like my childhood fantasy of one endless sprawling story, perhaps what triggered it was The New Gods by Jack Kirby. And these connected on to... every issue stood alone, but every issue was part of this larger tapestry. And it was really cool. I'm trying to... You got all kinds of characters and stories as part of your... I'm not finding the one I would really like to find. Oh well. Because I remember, you know, in this at times, here it is, The Pact, we would get stories that were completely... They were also complete, but they were part of the background and didn't involve any of the regular characters, like Light, in this case of New Gods, like Light Ray and Orion, because it was the story of the parents, basically. But anyway, it was just a wonderful feeling of tapestry made up of short stories. And one could argue that Jack Kirby wanted to just tell one long story, but back then you weren't allowed to. You were expected to do one and done stories. It was just assumed that your readers were not going to get every issue, either because they couldn't find them or because readers were sort of coming and going all the time. But in any case, I look back on it as kind of an ideal. If you want to do a larger story, create it with a lot of shorter stories. And real short stories rather than things that claim to be single stories but aren't. Anyhow, maybe we're seeing a resurgence of, you know, we're getting a few ongoing series like Daredevil and Astro City, but we're also getting more and more of, thanks to digital, where these stories originate. Because I think when they're printing digital stories, they're thinking this is for a more general audience. You shouldn't need to have this big background to read it. And so they're emphasizing the one and dones and the creativity going more into how you tell that story, that single story, rather than the creativity go into the larger scope of what you imagine. So thanks to that phenomenon in the digital comics, maybe we'll get more of a mix of short stories in comics for the next few years. And if so, I'm really happy with that. So, talk to you all later. Bye-bye.